Oh, you're in your meeting.
Yeah, I guess.
Good evening, everybody. We are just going to wait for a few more folks to join us as give it a few more minutes before we start the presentation tonight. So thank you for your patience. All right, looks like we'll go ahead and get started here today. Welcome everyone, my name is Noah Burke. I'm with Wilson and Company. We're a sub-consultant on this project with the New Mexico Department of Transportation. I'd like to welcome everyone to the New Mexico Electric Vehicle Infrastructure presentation. This is our public engagement meeting for District 3, but anybody can attend and should. And I will, with that, I'll go over a few little housekeeping things. So just first, that the chat icon can be accessed by clicking the chat icon as seen on the screen. So you can go ahead and use the chat icon to input your email address if you'd like us to receive emails about this subject, or you can go ahead and just input any type of chat. Also, polls will take place throughout the meeting and will be shown automatically, but can also be accessed via the polls icon as shown on the screen here. We ask that you submit questions using the Q&A function. So rather than using the chat function, we'd like it if you could use the Q&A function for questions. And we'll answer all these questions at the end of the presentation tonight. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Angelica Bryant with Wilson and Company. She will be doing the Spanish translation. And it's available by clicking the closed caption or interpretation icon. And Angelica will go ahead and say this off in Spanish for you. I think you're muted, Angelica. I think we might just be having a little technical difficulty with Angelica's microphone. Just bear with us for a second. Okay. Well, I think in the meantime, since we're having technical difficulties there, but Spanish translation is available by pressing the interpretation or closed caption icon on the bottom, and you will be able to hear that. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Damon. And Damon, go ahead and you're up.
Very good. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you, Noah. I'm Damon Fordham with High Street Consulting. I am part of the team supporting the New Mexico DOT on this effort, and I'll be presenting tonight along with my colleague, Carrie Giles from ICF. This is the third meeting of 6 public involvement meetings. We're focusing on District 3 tonight, but as Noah said, it's similar content for each meeting, and everyone is invited. This slide shows the agenda. So after some introductions, we'll talk a little bit about the context for electric vehicle planning in New Mexico. We'll talk about the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or the NEVI program, and some of the requirements of that funding that will be coming to the New Mexico DOT. We'll look at where existing EV chargers are in the state and in District 3 in particular. And along the way, we'll do some polls. So we'll have some pop-up polls that come up and you can answer some questions. And then we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. So as Noah said, you can type in your questions along the way in the Q&A box, and then we'll review all of those at the end of the meeting and go through them together. We've scheduled about 90 minutes for this evening, but we may finish sooner depending on the extent of the questions. So we're very glad you're here, and look forward to sharing some information and hearing back from you all on the line tonight. I'd like to ask our New Mexico DOT colleagues to introduce themselves before we start with our presentations.
David, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This public engagement meeting is very important to the process of establishing the NEVI statewide implementation plan. And so I want to take a moment to introduce myself and my team here at NMDOT. My name is Jerry Valdez. I'm the Executive Director out of the Office of the Secretary, and I'm leading this initiative along with some of my staff that are joining us here tonight, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Mr. Paul Montoya and Leonard Manzanares.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Montoya. I'm the Program Director for the NEVI statewide implementation plan. As Mr. Valdez said, we are really looking forward to your input and participation as we develop our plan so that we can develop the most robust plan for the citizens of the state of New Mexico. And again, thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to be here with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Leonard Manzanares from NMDOT next.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leonard Manzanares. I am the program coordinator with the NMDOT in the efforts to help my team and my colleagues deploy the electric vehicle charging stations for the citizens of New Mexico. Great to be here, and look forward to the progress and completion of the set objective. Thank you, guys.
David, I'd also like to take a moment to thank our other sister agency partners who have joined us on this initiative, and there's many of them who are on the call today. New Mexico Energy and Minerals Department, New Mexico Environment Department, PRC, as well as our GSD partners, who without them and many other stakeholders, we would not be able to be successful in the deployment of this program. So before we get started, I want to send a thank you to them and a thank you to all the citizens who are joining us tonight and taking time from their families or other important things to make sure that their voices are heard during this public engagement session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jerry and everyone from our sister agencies. So as we get started here, this slide will come up again at the end, but we wanted to put it up at the beginning just in case anyone drops off because it has some important information on it. First of all, we have a survey, and we'd love for folks to take the survey. It's intended for members of the general public, and it's available in English and in Spanish. The link will be posted in the chat box. And you can also scan the QR code on the screen there with your cell phone. You just point it and take a picture. It will link to the survey via that QR code. In addition to the survey, we have an email address, which is being monitored and used to collect information and answer questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to use that email address, nmdot.neviplan@state.nm.us. Third, we also have a project website. That website is getting updated regularly, and as new information is available, we'll post it there, and we'll also post developments of the project along the way. And lastly, if you would like to provide your email address to the project team, I see some people have already started doing this in the chat box, but we would welcome you to provide your email address, and that way we can keep in touch and share future notifications. You can drop that into the chat box. If you do it just to the host and the panelists, it'll just come to us. If you do it to everyone, then everyone else will see that. So with that, we can move to the next slide. And this is our first poll. So this poll is just simply to collect zip codes. We're interested to see who is on the line for each of these meetings and which zip codes are represented. So if you just type in your 5-digit zip code into the poll response box there, we'll collect those up, and that'll give us a good sense of who all participated from around the state in these public meetings. And we have about, I don't know if folks can see this, but we have about, it says 29 attendees as well as the folks from the agency. So we've probably got about 40 folks on the line here tonight in the meeting, which is great. All right, looks like we might have reached just about critical mass on that poll. So with these open field responses, you won't be able to see the responses that come in, but we'll be able to collect them. Some of the other polls, you'll be able to see how everyone voted and see the responses. All right, let's close that one out, Noah, and then we can move into the presentation. All right, and we can jump to the next slide, which is just an introduction to electric vehicles, or EVs. So we're talking about battery electric vehicles. Sometimes they're called BEVs. They're pure electric vehicles with no internal combustion engine. So they use a battery pack to store all the electrical energy they need, and then that energy powers the motor. So they don't use any gasoline or diesel, and they need to be charged. Right? They're charged by plugging the vehicle into an electric power source, a charger, and that charger may have one or more ports, and those ports each can charge an individual EV. A lot of people will charge their electric vehicle at home, often overnight, so it's ready for the morning, or maybe at their workplace. But for longer trips between cities and into different states, you need to be able to charge along the way, just as you might refuel your internal combustion engine vehicle. So to do that, you need publicly accessible charging along your route, and that's what we're talking about tonight. Is thinking through how to locate publicly accessible EV charging stations across New Mexico. All right, next slide. So nationally, there is a lot going on around electric vehicles and around responding to climate change. The bipartisan infrastructure law also called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is part of what brings us here today. We will touch on that in a few slides. That's the federal legislation that funded the NEVI program. But before we do that, there's also a lot going on in New Mexico. In 2019, the governor signed an executive order that committed the state to the Paris agreements and established a climate action priority for the state. And that executive order also set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. And then subsequent work identified transportation electrification as a key strategy. Also in 2019, the state passed the Energy Transition Act that required investor-owned utilities to produce 100% carbon-free electricity by 2045. And also the state began to distribute funds from the Volkswagen settlement to reduce transportation emissions across the state. So more recently, the Environment Department have been hard at work continuing to distribute those VW settlement funds to qualified projects. That also helps fund electric vehicle charging, and also leading a process to clean car rules, which were adopted earlier this month for the state. So next slide. So the Clean Car Rule and the NEVI plan will help to reduce transportation emissions across the state. Transportation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state, but nationally it's the highest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And almost all the emissions that come from transportation, 97%, are due to the combustion of fossil fuels. So switching to electric is a huge help in that regard. The NEVI work is joining other efforts that the New Mexico DOT is taking to address climate change. The agency is actively working to build a climate change program, including resiliency planning that will help make the state's transportation infrastructure more resilient to extreme weather and other hazards, developing carbon reduction strategies, implementing multimodal plans, and updating facilities with energy efficiency technologies and solar. So these efforts and others will be evolving, and there may well be additional public meetings related to some of those efforts. So keep an eye out for those engagement opportunities in the future. So this slide shows where electric vehicles are currently located in the state. These bright green blobs that you see are the zip codes with at least 100 electric vehicles registered in the zip code. So we kind of think of these areas as the early adopters, and it's likely that we'll see EV adoption growing out from those areas as EVs become more available and more widespread in the future. The next slide here shows existing traffic volumes. So these are the major roadways in the state, and the width of the pink line is how much traffic is flowing on those roadways. The metric is average annual daily traffic, AADT. And you can see that some of the busiest areas are on I-10 in the south, from El Paso and Ciudad Juarez back and forth into Arizona, east-west across the middle of the state on I-40, on I-25 between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and then up to Española and Los Alamos. And then also a little bit up in the northwest corner around Farmington, Bloomfield, and Aztec. So we'll be looking at these corridors of existing traffic as we're thinking about where electric vehicle charging infrastructure may be needed. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Carrie Giles, and she'll talk a little bit about the NEVI program and its requirements.
Thanks, Damon. As Damon mentioned, this is just one aspect then of multiple programs that New Mexico DOT and New Mexico as a state as a whole are working on for their electric vehicle efforts. Tonight, we are focusing on the bipartisan infrastructure law funding that created the NEVI formula, but there are other programs out there, both state and federal, that are available for electric vehicles. So I would encourage you to reach out, look at this first link under grant programs, reach out to Land of Enchantment Clean Cities, which I see on the phone here tonight, for other Department of Energy funding opportunities, and to really know that this is just one aspect of the electric vehicle puzzle, working specifically tonight on what we can do on highways and on alternative fuel corridors. But under that purview, there's a lot of other funding and programs out there. Part of that is under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the bill. It funds a NEVI program, but it also funds additional competitive grant programs that will be coming out this fall. So keep an eye out for those as well. They're supposed to be announced, the programs will be announced a bit more by November, according to the legislation. And those are programs that fund community locations. They fund school programs. There's a lot of other non-highway programs within that as well. So definitely, if you're looking for anything off the highways, please look at those, as well as the EPA Clean School Bus Program has recently opened up funding for electric, natural gas, or propane school buses across the nation. So there are other programs out there that you can get to by this link, which are the slides will be available online. So just know that this is just one component here of the larger electric vehicle puzzle. So within the NEVI program, New Mexico will receive approximately $38 million over 5 years, and that's via formula funding, guaranteed funding, not competitive funding. So if you could go to the next slide. Part of that is, part of the NEVI funding is, the goal there is to create convenient, reliable, affordable, and equitable charging stations, DC fast charging stations specifically, to create an interconnected network nationally and across the state. So that we can really get around. And as part of that, there's approximately 5.8 million allocated for the first year of funding for this program. The initial funds are directed to designated alternative fuel corridors, prioritizing interstate highways. Alternative fuel corridors are corridors that have been nominated previously and recently by New Mexico DOT to federal US DOT to FHWA, federal highways, to say that, hey, there's electric vehicle charging available already, or there's electric vehicle charging in the works along these corridors. And we'll get into why that's important later. But these are basically corridors that have already been chosen in part by New Mexico DOT, part by US DOT, then to approve those to put in this DC fast charging for these funds. But just a little bit of a background of what we're doing and why timeline-wise. So the bill was passed in November of last year. And the guidance specifically for the NEVI program, the initial guidance came out in February, and we are currently awaiting some more detailed standards and requirements from the federal government, from the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. That should be out sometime this spring, if you see there on our timeline. And what we've begun is the public and stakeholder engagement plan. We have to create, for the NEVI program, every state has to create a plan on how they will equitably distribute these funds across the state based on some parameters that we'll go through here in a moment. And so all of these states are all working on this very compressed timeline to have these plans ready and delivered to the federal government by August 1st. And then FHWA and the Joint Office will review the plans and approve them, or let us know if there's any edits or work that needs to be done still in the plan by the end of September. So then the funds, that $5.8 million, then it becomes available for the projects that we'll talk about here. There are several parts of the plan. It's in some ways, it's a formula that we need to work on. So if you can go to the next slide. These plan components, these chapters or sections, if you will, that we'll be writing about, just so you know, they are the framework and kind of the minimum requirements. New Mexico is looking to see what we can do to go beyond just some of the minimum requirements. You know, yes, it's a formula program, but we don't want the exact same plan that every other state has. We want to make sure this plan is customized to the best needs of New Mexico. And that's part of what we're looking for, working with you and working with the stakeholder interviews that we're doing, which are ongoing. Like that compressed timeline, we're still working on some of those. So trying to find out exactly how best to customize the plan for New Mexico within these categories for these components here. Just if you look down the list, some of this is self-explanatory: introduction, state agency coordination, public engagement, what we've done here, what we've done via the website, via our survey materials, and just other feedback that we've collected. If you'll notice, there's an email address for more detailed information. So we're really trying to find out, again, what the public needs the most of this plan, and that will then drive the vision and goals of the plan, as noted here. There's several items in here around contracting, implementation, program evaluation, about how in the plan we need to write how the money will actually be, distributed and how that will be evaluated, how that money will be monitored, and then how that ongoing plan will be implemented. I should say the funding is for the purchase of 80%, up to 80% the cost of the purchase, the installation, and the maintenance and operation of these stations. So it's not a put it in the ground and forget about it funding program. It is very much a fund it and then make sure the stations are still operable 5 years from now. 10 years from now. So that is a key component there of the funding. So figuring out the plan for ongoing maintenance and operation is crucial. As part of that, also, there's an existing and future conditions analysis, part of which Damon will show you here in a few moments for what's already in the state and why that existing infrastructure may or may not matter based on the new requirements for charging stations. And then as to how actually the EV charging infrastructure deployment will occur, not just what the goals are, focusing on the interstates first, and then what happens if there's extra funds. 38 million sounds like a great number, but at the end of the day, when you're talking about EV charging infrastructure for the entire state, it can be stretched thin. So we do want to work on some innovative solutions to how we get into every corner of the state and how we have an equitable distribution of this funding. As part of that there, you can see civil rights and equity, as mentioned already, they're key components, and we'll dive into those deeper in a moment. Labor and workforce. The goal of this plan, if you've read the full title, so it's bipartisan infrastructure law, or also known as the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, key component there being jobs. What is going to happen to train the workforce in New Mexico to be able to maintain and operate these stations, to install these stations, the labor that goes into all the other installation requirements, not just the electrical, but working on the sites, working on the plans. There's working on the lighting, working on what other, depending on where these stations are located, there's other components of a station. So there's more here to it than just the installation. There's lots of jobs and workforce components that need to be evaluated as part of this program. Cybersecurity and discretionary exceptions are a little standard for cybersecurity. What are we doing to keep the stations safe and to keep them up? And especially since these stations will all be network stations where we're able to look remotely at to what the uptime is. Discretionary exceptions are just if New Mexico is trying to do anything different from what the guidance is, and we can put that information there. So if you can go to the next slide, the justity and equity considerations are, as already mentioned, a key part of this, and it goes beyond just what you would normally think of as a low-income community or a disadvantaged community. The Federal Justice 40 Initiative is the federal initiative to have 40% of all federal spending right now for this, for several programs, including NEVI, to go to 40% of the disadvantaged community. And that is being defined in different ways than you might have normally seen, but it's really getting into the communities that are at risk from climate change, that have a higher energy burden, traffic proximity or diesel exposure. Just because if you live along the highways, you're exposed to those fumes every single day. So even if you can't personally drive an electric vehicle, what if we can reduce the highway emissions that are right behind your home so that you're getting the cleaner air that way? So there's different ways to look at the traffic proximity, whether or not people can actually get into an electric vehicle themselves at the moment. And that usually relates then also to housing burden costs and additional proximity to pollution, whether, it could be back to the highway, but it could also be back to a power plant. There's different components there, or you back to something that has exposure to wastewater discharge. And that goes hand in hand then with the prevalence of asthma, diabetes, heart disease in a community. If you're breathing in that air and you're already at risk to begin with, it's twice the exposure, twice the issue. And linguistic isolation and employment poverty fits more into what some people might think of as our quote unquote standard idea of a low income or disadvantaged community. But there's lots of components here. So there's some people could be at risk right now from every single one of these issues. Some could have one or two. So we're looking at equity through multiple lenses basically here to find out what we can do to really reach across the state and to make sure that this plan isn't just focused, on, hey, we did this one corridor, it goes north, south, it goes east, west, the state's done, call it a day. That's not what New Mexico wants to see. They want to see something that reaches across the entire state and to help everyone, not just your quote unquote early adopters who've driven electric vehicles for years. But as part of that, if we can go to the next slide, when I mentioned that these are alternative fuel corridors federally designated, nominated by New Mexico DOT, these are the roads that, as I said, had electric vehicles or electric vehicle charging stations planned. However, there's now additional requirements for this funding program. Typically, if you would go to an electric vehicle charging station, you might find one electric vehicle charging station at that site. However, for these requirements, it's much more stringent. So we need to build up and build out on what's already there to complement that existing infrastructure. So for NEVI, there have to be charging stations every 50 miles along the interstate highway system, and those have to be within 1 mile of exiting the interstate. You can't go down a mile-long off-ramp and then drive 3 miles across town to find the station. It has to be within 1 mile of that exit. And then for the chargers, this is the crucial part that Damon will show you visually in a few moments. There have to be 4 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers, sometimes known as level 3, with CCS ports available at the site. Or sorry, 4 of these ports, I should say. They have to be capable of simultaneously charging then 4 electric vehicles at that actual electrical capacity. It can't be, one station that happens to have 4 ports but doesn't have the electrical power behind it to actually charge 4 vehicles at once. So think of these more comparable as to pulling up to a gas station where there's multiple pumps. This will be pulling up to a charging station where there's multiple ports to plug in your electric vehicle. If you go to the next slide, so as mentioned before, the priority to begin with is the interstate highways, and then working through these other right here as shown in the bold colors, other alternative fuel corridors. So we have interstate, state, and US highways along the current designations in New Mexico. So first we'll be focusing on those shown in purple, and then pink and yellow will be in the mix as well then once the interstate's built out. And then technically, if there's additional funds, then additional community roads could be considered at the end of the 5 years if these highways, these alternative fuel corridors are already built out, but that's pending funding availability. However, as I mentioned before, there are other competitive programs that could help actually fill in this network as well. So if you could just go to the next slide, please. This is District 3 specific here. Just wanted to show exactly, I'm sure you all know exactly what interstates and highways are within the district. But as you can see here, the purple interstates, we have north-south, we have east-west. We'll be able to cut right, connect Albuquerque basically to the rest of the state with electric vehicle charging. And again, Damon will show you some of the specifics in just a few minutes. But for now, I just wanted to do one quick poll with you and asking you which of the following applies to you. Do you own or lease an electric vehicle already? Are you planning to, or do you have no intentions to own or lease an electric vehicle in the future? And Noah, do we have responses already?
Yes, we've got 21.
All right, if you want to go ahead and show those results. Great mix so far. So it sounds like most on the phone are intending to own or lease an electric vehicle either, or they already have, or they're intending to in the future. Again, we are trying to find out too, especially for those who don't own, what has been your biggest barrier? Feel free to let us know in a survey to electric vehicle adoption. But now I will turn it back over to Damon for some more of those details.
Great, thank you, Carrie. That was really good. So just before we move on, I wanted to mention we're seeing questions and questions coming in. So that's great. We'll be mostly answering the questions at the end of the presentation. So stay tuned and we'll be responding to those. There was a couple of clarifying things. One was, will the slides or a recording be available? Yes, they will, and they'll be posted to the website just as soon as we can get them up there. Another question was about CHAdeMO chargers. So that's a type of connection to the vehicle. This program requires CCS, so a different type of charger, which is becoming, or a different type of connector, which is becoming more standardized. It does not require CHAdeMO, but we are looking at that. We're aware that there are vehicles out there that do need CHAdeMO connectors, and looking at what we can do to make sure we get the most usable network out in the field. But CHAdeMO is not technically required under this program. Okay, I think the other questions are mostly kind of longer questions, so we'll save those to the end. Let's see, the current screen there, what we have is the existing EV chargers that are publicly accessible in the state. So this data comes from the Alt Fuel data center, which is a DOE kind of verified database. We are aware that there are some publicly accessible charges out there that aren't shown in that database, perhaps because they haven't been verified yet or they're much newer. But this is what's in the DOE database: 178 publicly accessible EV chargers across New Mexico. And this includes all levels of chargers. So it's not only DC fast chargers, but it's also level 1 and level 2. And it includes all connector types. So it does include the Tesla network that's out there. The next slide just zooms in a little bit on District 3. So in District 3, there's 66 public locations. So that's actually more than a third of all publicly accessible EV chargers right now are in District 3 and around Albuquerque. There are in those 66 locations, there's 117 level 2 ports, so the slower charging ports, and 35 DC fast charger ports. So again, a port is the individual plug that goes to the vehicle, and there may be multiple ports at each location. 29 of the ports are Tesla charging stations. Just one last thing on District 3. These locations are a mix of places like car dealerships, convenience stores. I believe there's some national park locations, shopping centers, the airport, and hotels. All right, so the next slide that we've come to here is the NEVI compliant chargers. So these are the chargers that comply with all those things Carrie mentioned earlier, all those requirements. So they're CCS connectors, they're DC fast chargers, they have 4 ports, they are within 1 travel mile of the interstate, and they're publicly accessible for 24 hours a day. So there's 8 of those right now in existence. And in the next slide, we can see District 3, and there's 1 in District 3 that's at the Walmart there. The next slide shows the kind of the same information, but just a little bit different representation. What we've done is we've put a 50-mile, 25-mile radius around each of those existing chargers. So that's the bright green lines along the corridors, which kind of shows the segments of the highway that are currently compliant, and shows the gaps where we need to fill in the gaps through the NEVI program. Next slide shows that in District 3, and you can see that I-40 is pretty well covered there, but I-25 is not covered to the north and the south. All right, so time for another poll, and this one is about where you think publicly accessible charging stations should be located. So we'd invite you to select up to 3. You can select more, but we're hoping you'll stick to 3, and just pick your top 3. So there's interstate highways, there's highways with existing high traffic volumes, there's areas where there's gaps in the network, in rural areas, in more urban areas and cities, at tourism destinations, and in disadvantaged communities. So you may need to scroll down or make your window bigger to see the options at the bottom of the list there. Give folks a little bit more time since there's a lot to read here. All right, we're probably getting close. All right, I think we can probably close that out. So the top 3 in order were locate charges where there are gaps in the network, locate along interstates, and locate along highways with the highest traffic volumes. So that's great. and then fewer votes for some of those other options. So appreciate that. The next slide has another poll question, and this question is about what amenities are needed at those publicly accessible EV charging stations. So you can select up to 5 on this poll. So you can select up to 5 of these options. We have lighting, restrooms, shade, shelter, food and beverage, 24-hour access, having someone available on site, customer service person, retail, shopping, and safety and security, or other. And if you select other, feel free to stick that in the chat box and explain what else we may have missed there. All right, looks like we're getting to the end of the responses. Give them another few seconds here. All right, I think we're probably pretty close. So this, I think, if I remember correctly, this mirrors some of the responses we had from some of our public meetings we've already held. So the most important things for people are restrooms and 24-hour access. Lighting is also important, and shade and shelter is important, as well as security, and a little bit less so food and beverage, and not as interested in having a customer service agent available or in retail shopping other than the food and beverage maybe. And we had one other as well. So that's super helpful. Appreciate that input. And then we got one last poll question, and this is an open response field. So we're asking just for a general input on where are chargers needed, and that could be a city in the state, it could be a part of a city, it could be a county, a pueblo, it could be I don't know, a university or a recreation site, national park. You can just type in anything and everything that springs to mind where you think chargers are needed, and we're going to compile all those answers, and that'll help us think through areas around the state where chargers may be needed. And again, the priority focus and the first sort of round of funding is on every 50 miles along the interstate highway system, but we're also using this plan to help inform the use of future funding streams, grants, community charges. So we're really looking for as much input as possible. And if something can't be funded in this first round because it's not on the interstate, that doesn't mean that it's not still a priority location that could be funded through other mechanisms or once that interstate system is built out. All right, we'll give another 30 seconds or so on this one. All right, some good participation in the polls. That's great. Okay. Still getting some answers coming in. All right, I think we're probably about there, Noah. Great. Again, can't see the answers on that one because it's open field, but we'll compile all those and probably try and represent all of that input in some kind of GIS spatial representation for use in the poll, for use in the plan, sorry. Okay, so what's next? So we're kind of concluding our public meeting here tonight. We'll move into the Q&A. We have 3 more meetings after this, public meetings. We're also doing a range of stakeholder input with more targeted groups like the EV charging industry and the utilities. So we're learning a lot, we're hearing a lot, and we're going to be putting that all together as we're developing the plan here. The plan is due to the federal government August 1st, and NEVI funding will start to flow if everything goes according to plan later on in calendar year 2022. There'll also be additional funding programs and grants that are coming online, as Carrie mentioned. So the state will be pursuing those, leveraging those funds, packaging funds together to really try and optimize the deployment of the EV charging infrastructure around the state. So that's what's coming next. What we'd love to do now is move to the Q&A. So I'll invite our New Mexico DOT colleagues to help answer some of these questions. Carrie will help me answer some of the questions. We've got a number in the Q&A box here, and I think I saw a couple in the chat box as well. So we'll try and get through all of them here tonight. So the first question, which is a great question, is about economic development, and in particular economic development in smaller towns and villages, helping to make use of local businesses by people that are stopping to charge and maybe have some money to spend while they wait for their vehicle to charge. So how can the state consider using charging stations to revitalize rural areas and kind of reimagine travel around the state to get off the highway and explore local main streets? I think that's a great question. I'm sure Jerry and others have got some answers to that. I think the sort of basic response is we have to follow the guidance for NEVI for this. The initial funding that's coming, has to be 1 mile or less from the interstate. So that does restrict things a little bit, but I think the broader mindset is all about economic development. It's all about workforce development. It's all about getting the charging out to more rural areas that are maybe away from the interstates in later phases of the kind of EV charging rollout. But certainly economic development and rural accessibility are real priorities once those interstate corridors have been built out and there's that interstate national network of chargers. But Jerry, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
David, thank you. And geographically, New Mexico is the 5th largest state in the nation. We're a rural state, and all too often, rural New Mexico is left behind. And I can tell you that under this program, that will not happen. The NEVI definitely has its limitations, and we'll address those limitations every 50 miles. However, we have a strategy in place that we believe that when we finalize this plan, that we're going to be able to address the interstate and still be able to address rural New Mexico. There was another question that we're going to touch upon on 550 and going into the Navajo Nation here in a bit. But you know what? There are funding opportunities. We're going to partner with our local communities to make sure that they take advantage of every single grant opportunity and notice of funding opportunities that is available to them. And the DOT, although we will not be responsible for oversight of those funds, what we want to do is have technical support and guidance for those local entities who need our help and our guidance. We have our federal partners on the line today. I want to publicly recognize Mr. Rodolfo Monge from FHWA, who is a partner with the DOT, New Mexico DOT. And so from a federal and state perspective, we're going to make sure that these rural communities have the support, the guidance, and the technical help they need to make sure that they're tapping into every single federal opportunity that they can to expand this EV infrastructure throughout our state and to really meet the unique needs of New Mexico. We're not in the East Coast and we're not California, we're New Mexico. And we're going to make sure that we build this system to meet New Mexicans' needs, as well as traversing the state for those who come in and visit and traveling through our state on a daily basis.
Thanks, Jerry. I think you touched on the next couple of questions, but that sort of area of Northwest New Mexico and 550 kind of areas of outside major cities. I don't know if there's anything specifically you wanted to mention there.
Yeah, if I could mention just that. So our alternative fuel corridors were established over a course of 5 different years. And some of us weren't here, and this isn't a way to point the finger at anybody. There was very valid reasons why corridors were established. But early on, when we were looking at these corridors and these alternative fuel corridors, you're absolutely right. Northwest New Mexico is glaringly absent in regards to this infrastructure needs. And so I commit to making sure that we are going to be able to fund and look at areas throughout that 550 and Northwest corridor. When you're thinking about places like Salt Lake City, Cortez, Colorado, and other major locations, there is no way to get to those areas with an interstate. You have to go through rural New Mexico. You have to use US and New Mexico roads to get to your destination. I, for one, travel to Salt Lake City regularly, so I know the needs of 550 in the Northwest area. And so we are looking at alternative funding mechanisms that will help us grow in those areas outside of the NEVI program. The NEVI program, again, is $38 million to build out the national network. However, with $2.5 billion that is going to be readily available for other rural build out through a notice of funding opportunities, we want to make sure that we're looking at all funding sources to make sure that we address those gaps throughout our state.
Great, thank you. Let's see if I can find a couple more questions. So does the funding help with utility system upgrades that are needed for fast chargers? And this may be a question for Carrie. You may have the box better defined in your head of where the funding ends in terms of the interaction with the utilities that are needed to get that high power grid connection to these fast chargers.
So for NEVI program, from the guidance that we've seen so far, it does not look like the grid updates will be included. However, there are, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, there are several other grid programs and funding programs. Some of those competitive funds that we talked about as well, some of those specifically target, okay, what do you need to do to update the entire, system, whether that goes into the grid, the transformer, et cetera, to bring charging to certain locations. So from what we've seen so far from the NEVI guidance, that would be a no for the grid updates. However, there are other funding opportunities that will be available for utilities to take advantage of, and for those working with utilities for other applications for EV charging stations to work on later this year. So keep an eye out. I mean, the Department of Energy just launched a new clean energy grid program today. It's nonstop announcements from DOE about some of these funding opportunities.
And if I can just add as well that I don't think it's no coincidence that the federal office that's overseeing the implementation of the statewide implementation plans is the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. Energy capacity is a huge issue as it relates to the build out of this infrastructure. So we're going to be working closely with not only the energy providers, but our sister agencies throughout the state to make sure that we're addressing these energy capacity issues, and that the unforeseen help in building out that grid is going to be a positive thing as we're looking at this infrastructure, because it's going to take energy to areas that may not have existed before, just like broadband. Expanding the energy grid and looking at alternative renewable energy sources is going to be a big part of this, as well as the infrastructure that we're building out.
Yes, and specifically for that broadband question, there are other funds to, as part of this bill as well, to bring the nation's internet and to bring that connectivity up. I know how much out west we have so many areas where there's no cell phone service that the rest of the country doesn't really understand. But yes, that's part of the program as well. Not this specific program, but part of the funding program is to make those connections happen. So that is being taken into consideration.
Yeah, so that question about broadband was how do chargers find how do drivers find the stations if broadband's not available? So that's a great question. As Carrie said, there are efforts to try and improve broadband access. I think right now we're looking at cell service availability, but we're also looking at other means to make sure that these charging stations can be used as in as widespread a manner as possible. So an example is not limiting a charger to just folks that have an account or are accessing the charger with an app and getting charged to their account, but also allowing credit card payment so that anyone can use it and not have to have many different accounts. But I don't know, Carrie, if you wanted to add anything to that, just to sort of the wayfinding
Yes.
considerations for EV chargers in rural areas?
So as part of that, I dropped into chat as well, as part of the Infrastructure Act law, whichever name you want to use for it. There's also a request to create a new version of that DOE alternative fuels data center that really shows the up and down time of each station, and to really improve kind of that that station. That DOE alt fuels data center will become the official data center that DOE and DOT, that joint office that Mr. Valdez talked about, that they're using to see what stations are where. And as part of that, for most vehicles, for those who drive an electric vehicle, they know for most vehicles, you're able now to actually download station locations directly into your vehicle. So when you're at home and able to connect to the internet, you're able to download those stations. So that would be the latest and greatest. So there are, I know, discussions about, okay, that's the alternative if you can't access, your cell phone service to find a station to, go through an app. Hopefully in the future, we'll be able to make sure all the vehicles all the charging stations are downloaded as data on the maps within vehicles. And I know some OEMs have already talked about like what they would need to do to change the software on their vehicles to make sure that's available for everyone. So those are options. And again, these have to be the publicly available stations. So I hate to say it, but if you're the Tesla driver pulling up the Tesla station, these would not be Tesla stations as well. So there are some different considerations that are going into some of that mapping for some of those download possibilities.
All right. Are the chargers going to be owned and operated by New Mexico DOT? I will let Mr. Valdez answer that one.
Thank you. And one of the great opportunities that this bill provides is for us to partner with private industry as well as public entities to build out this infrastructure. So there'll be a hybrid approach. Some of these charging stations will be under the onus of DOT and will be responsible for the operation and maintenance. But more so that we're looking at engaging in partnerships with our public and private entities to provide those opportunities that, quite frankly, some of you guys have asked us to look at, and putting them in areas in rural New Mexico that provide economic relief to some of the hardest hit communities around our state. Give those entities an opportunity to use this EV charging station, like somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, not to only remain on the interstate system, but to also travel on the back roads of New Mexico and provide opportunities for those areas that are rural and provide economic growth for those communities as well as along the interstate. So absolutely, there'll be a hybrid approach of both public and private ownership of these charging stations, which the bill does, in fact, provide an opportunity to do so.
Great, thanks. We've just put up our last slide here, just in case folks have to drop off, and we wanted to get those mechanisms to connect with us up in front of people. But we have several more questions to answer, which we're going to go through. So will each state have a different charging network that will require different accounts, or will one account work for all 50 states? So I think the answer to this one is it will be this national charging network that the NEVI funding envisions, starting off along the interstates, is really a network about having a consistent user experience from one station to the next, and that's why the program lays out those minimum requirements. But it won't be a network that's operated by one operator, or a network that looks the same or has exactly the same functionality. It will be a network that is made up of many different organizations and entities that are part of this ecosystem of EV charging. I think we're all working towards an experience where you don't have to have many different accounts and different logins, and different accounts connected to your credit cards. But it won't be one single network, owned and operated by one private entity across the whole of the U.S. It'll be different types of charging stations, but all meeting those minimum functionality requirements. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that.
There's a question in the chat as well about just interoperability in general. And I think that's something we're all waiting to see as well. I mentioned there was additional guidance coming out that we're waiting for the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation to release. And I think we are hoping to see if there's any more information there. But it should be, there's already discussions about, how to make these, so that maybe you don't have to log into an app every time. Maybe you can use your credit card and just have it be very similar to a gas station experience. So those are items that we're working on within the plan as well to try to improve the customer experience and to, create less fear of going to a new charging station, being like, oh no, do I have the app? Do I have, this program? What do I need to do? Especially if we don't have cell phone access to download an app when you go to a station. So there are those considerations that will be going into the plan.
Thanks. Oh, sorry, Jerry, were you going to jump in there?
No, and we're definitely looking at all the aspects. We want to make sure accessibility for all is at the front end of this plan, and making sure that everybody gets the same experience, no matter if you're in urbanized or rural areas around the state.
It's a great question. And thanks, Karen, for pointing out there's a few questions coming in the chat here. I see someone also noting that, having that up-to-date information on not just where stations are located, but which ones are operating is critical. Too many stations are down. We're aware of that. Definitely kind of uptime and reliability is something we're talking about with the EV charging station installers and operators, and kind of how you measure that, even getting into the weeds on that. And even if the data is an hour old, if you're trying to get at a station that's down, it's an hour old is an hour too long. So we're aware of that. Definitely something we're making sure we're discussing with the EV charging installers. Okay, how will cost to charge be determined? That's TBD. These are most likely, as Jerry said, to be operated by private parties, private enterprises, and so the cost to charge will be on a case-by-case market-driven basis. One thing that gets into that equation is demand charges that can result in high cost charging. So that's something we're very aware of and talking about as well. And kind of how that plays out as these EV charging stations are rolled out, and the role of the utilities is something that we're going to be talking with the utilities with closely. Another question or a question about higher power chargers. So 150 kilowatts is the kind of minimum per port in the NEVI program, and some folks may be aware, that's pretty good fast charging for right now. But some vehicles are designed or are going to be coming online that are able to take an even higher charge. So someone's asking about what about 350 kilowatt charging port. Again, something we've been talking about with the private sector. There's some interesting nuances in the NEVI requirements around chargers that are capable of charging at 150 kilowatts, and it's 600 kilowatts total for the 4 ports. But what does that mean if one of them could be a higher charging port at 350? So we're waiting for the guidance. I think there's going to be some more information coming around that, and thinking about whether or not there might be some locations where having maybe one of the ports be a higher capacity port to do even faster charging for vehicles that are able to take it is definitely something that we're looking at and thinking through. A little bit similar to the CHAdeMO question, there may be locations where having one or more ports be a CHAdeMO connector instead of a CCS, or as well as a CCS connector, may make sense. So those are definitely things that we're exploring. All right, let's see. Regarding justice and equity, are there programs funding to help disadvantaged actually purchase or lease an EV so they can take advantage of the new charges in their community? Carrie, is that one you can take? How are you familiar?
Yes, so
with
right now at the moment, there were several new tax incentives to reduce the price of electric vehicles in the federal Build Back Better plan that did not pass. So there are still different components for electric vehicle for helping with that cost being tossed around, and bills, I shouldn't say tossed around, being proposed in bills at the federal level. So we are hoping to see if any of those pass this year. So there is additional funding, but at the moment that's pretty much the extent of most of the electric vehicle discounts at the moment. Again, we do know that there's going to be lots of evolution during the next 5 years politically of what other programs support this, as well as once we get through the current supply chain issues, the price of electric vehicles in general are anticipated to drop dramatically. So we will see how this shakes out, but at the moment, unfortunately, there is no great answer I can provide for funding.
Great. Okay. Question about, well, not a question, a comment, I guess. Locate sites close to existing EV charging stations such as in California, where a variety of chargers are nearby. Tesla has locations that have room for other charging systems. So that's an interesting question or interesting point. If you have any more thoughts on that, feel free to type them up in the chat box, kind of on what you're thinking, because it's obviously a little bit different from the thinking of, you know, putting in chargers where there isn't currently charging that kind of fill in some gaps. Tesla has made an announcement that they're planning to open up their network to other charging types, people that aren't, you know, driving a Tesla. So that may help to open up charging stations. There obviously is some benefit to co-locating in terms of the grid connections and the three-phase power that's already there, and that may be a cost-effective way of getting more chargers out, or different types of connectors out. And they're also, along the same lines, we're also looking at where there's existing stations that don't meet the NEVI requirements, maybe because there's not enough ports, or maybe because they're not high enough power currently, and what it might take to upgrade those to make them NEVI compliant as a more cost-effective approach than just putting a new station in somewhere. So we're looking at all that. But again, if you have any other thoughts on kind of co-location and what the benefits of that might be, feel free to put them in the chat, and that'll be helpful information for us. All right, another question. Is there a list of where the New Mexico Volkswagen settlement money has been granted? There is, but that's probably the extent of the answer I know. I don't know if there are any more details available that can be shared on that. And I know Nidra was on the line earlier. She may have dropped off. Claudia, I think, is on the line. They may want to chime in as well. But Jerry, do you have any?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Claudia, are you on the line? I would love for our sister agency, Environment Department, if they can join us. If not, I can point you in that direction for sure. But Claudia, are you on?
Hi, yes, I am. Good evening, everyone. I am happy to put in the chat the information about the VW settlement money. I know there's a list of those that have received the awards for the VW money. I don't know if it's in map form, but I will be happy to see what I can do and maybe provide it for this project website if such a map is available.
Claudia, thank you so much. And I want to publicly thank Claudia for all her work that she's contributed. Again, like I said, we have very strong partnerships across sister agencies, and Claudia and her working group through the Climate Action Team have done a tremendous job in helping us and being strong partners in this initiative. So Claudia, thank you. And again, she will drop that into the website for further review. But I will say this as well. We are looking at the Volkswagen Settlement Fund and identifying where those funds have gone, and if there's any opportunity for us to utilize some of this federal funding along with that Volkswagen Settlement Fund to get these projects completed. It's going to be beneficial for the state to get that money on the road and doing what is intended to do, and that's build out this EV infrastructure around the state. So we are looking at that as well from a DOT perspective.
Great question. Okay, is there consideration given to using solar, photovoltaic, and batteries to power the chargers rather than connecting off the grid? Yes, although that may not be needed in some locations. Where in very rural areas where there isn't easy access to three-phase power, that could be a solution. Obviously more costly, and if you have a lot of vehicles charging, simultaneously, you can drain that battery storage down quickly. So there are some considerations there. Another thing we've talked about is just generally having a grid mix that has renewables in the grid mix. Is a nice way to make sure that the energy that's being used to power these vehicles is as clean and renewable as possible. So that's also something that I know we've talked about and can be helpful in terms of just increasing the use of renewables. Okay, will charging station usage data be reported to DOT on a monthly basis for tracking? Yes, there are data tracking and sharing requirements. I think Carrie, it's probably fair to say we're waiting on some more details in this pending guidance of exactly what the data sharing requirements will be, but those requirements will flow down to the private sector operators, and we'll make sure that at least the sort of minimum data that's required, like how many charging sessions, the types of charging, the how many unique users, all those types of things, that data will be reported and compiled publicly. Okay, let's see. Is the federal government changing the no concessions ban at interstate rest stops to allow for EV charging stations? That's a great question. So there is, for folks that aren't aware, there is a federal prohibition against commercial activity in the right-of-way that prohibits EV charging at interstate rest areas. And it is something that is talked about often. And I know there are a lot of folks thinking about that. I think it's probably fair to say at the current time, we have no information that restriction will be changing, but it is possible that it may change in the future. But as of right now, we're moving ahead with planning for these deployments at other types of locations. But Jerry, did you want to add anything to that?
No, and I think that's a great question. Initially, when we started looking at this plan, it really makes sense that you build out where the vehicles are and where they're stopping, and rest areas definitely is one of those areas. Unfortunately, because of the concessions that are made, it really is, from a federal perspective, the commercialization of our right-of-way has been an issue. And so we're going to continue to look at it, but like Damon talked about, we're moving forward with our plan. And if that does open up, then we will adjust our strategies. Again, this plan is going to be in place, but it's adjustable for the next 5 years. And so if that changes in the next 1 to 2, 3 years, then it'll open up the opportunity for us to look at those areas if in fact those changes are made under federal level. But great question. Thank you, Mark.
All right, I think we may just have one left here. Let's see. Since the power companies stand to gain the most in the transition from oil, gas to electric vehicles in the transportation sector, will they be contributing to the cost of EV infrastructure improvement? Let's see. I don't believe we have Mary Jane tonight, right? I think she wasn't able to make it, but I don't know if Jerry or Claudia or anyone else would want to take that one on.
I can, and I'm so sorry. We've had Mary Jane Park on for every other, but she couldn't make it tonight. But what I can say to that is that we're building strong relationships with our PRC working group as well. And we're working with our energy providers to see their role in how they can contribute to this EV infrastructure build out, including P&M and other co-ops around the state. And so it's an ongoing relationship that we continue to build upon. And again, to your point, they have the most to gain. And when we're looking at opportunities to partner, their contribution is going to be critical as we're looking at energy capacity as well as the build out of the grid. And again, as Damon talked about, it's all of our responsibilities to really make sure that we're fighting climate change. And so having a hybrid approach to solar and other renewables is going to be critical as we're looking at the build out of this infrastructure. So we will continue to build those strong relationships and help us as we're moving towards infrastructure and how energy provider and capacities play a role in this type of initiative.
Great, thanks, Jerry. All right. I believe this may be the last question, but I'll scan the chat box as well, just in case we missed anything. Let's see. One station location could draw a variety of vehicles where one will not need to advertise and you already have power there. Talk, Deming, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Gallup are examples of possible locations. One can see the benefits all over California. Okay, so I think that was just maybe a follow-up to that earlier question. Yeah, that was just a follow-up about kind of co-locating at one location, maybe where there's existing stations or existing Tesla chargers. Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that. All right. We have posted the survey link again in the chat box. So that's we'd love for folks to go take the survey and forward it on to your friends and family and stakeholders and anyone who you think may be helpful to fill that out. Again, it's a public survey, and we're going to be engaging with other stakeholders which have a specific perspective a little differently. But this public survey, we'd love to get widespread participation in. I think, unless any of my fellow panelists see any other questions that we missed in the chat box, I think we may be at the conclusion of questions. So we've had great participation here tonight. We've tailed off a little bit now. Some folks have left, but a lot of folks have stuck to the end, and we really appreciate that. Great questions, great participation. Thank you for the input via the poll. Again, if you have any questions and you want to send an email, there's the email address on the screen there, nmdot.neviplan@state.nm.us, and then the website at the bottom of the screen. Again, we're updating that. We're working to get that updated regularly. So some of the information that's been suggested, I see Claudia has posted some information about the VW settlement. Maybe we can add that link to our resources on the website. So keep checking back there for more information as it's available. So with that, we will close. And Jerry, I'd love for you to close us out here. And thanks so much for everyone that joined.
Thank you, Damon. And again, I just want to echo your sentiment about how grateful we are for everybody who participated tonight. This feedback is critical to the establishment of our statewide implementation plan. This is your plan. This is New Mexico's plan. And there's going to be multiple stakeholders that are going to be important to the success of this program. I especially want to thank our sister agencies. At today's call, I saw a tremendous amount of representation from across state government. I think that's a very important part of what we're doing to make sure that we're working together to get this right, as well as the public and industry who joined us tonight. A huge thank you from the New Mexico Department of Transportation. And there's going to be 3 more of these sessions coming up. So we encourage anybody that you know who missed it, please send them to one of the other 3, as well as the survey, to make sure that we're listening to a wide variety of the voice of our constituents. Your feedback matters. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. An hour and a half with State of New Mexico employees and talking about NEVI and EVs. You know, it's as important it is to us. I know there's a lot more important things and a lot funner things you could probably be doing, but this is pretty awesome that we have this opportunity to spend time together and talk about this very important initiative that's coming in New Mexico. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.